My friends, I wish you all a great Monday. You won. Now check this out. The Detroit Lions may have just received one of the biggest hidden pieces of good news they could possibly ask for right now, and it has absolutely nothing to do with a trade, a draft pick, or even an OTA performance. This is the kind of development that can quietly change the future of an entire roster, especially for a team that is trying to keep a championship window open for as long as possible. Because if you have been paying attention to what Detroit is building, then you already know the biggest challenge ahead is not talent. The Lions already have talent everywhere. The real challenge is figuring out how to keep all of these stars together once the massive contracts start stacking up. And for a while, there was real concern about what the future contract for Jahmyr Gibbs was eventually going to look like, because the reality is simple. Jahmyr Gibbs is not just another running back anymore. He has become one of the most explosive offensive weapons in the NFL. Every time he touches the football, defenses panic. He can break a run from anywhere on the field. He can destroy linebackers in the passing game, and he fits perfectly into what Ben Johnson helped create offensively before moving on. Gibbs is one of the faces of the future for Detroit, and eventually the Lions are going to have to pay him like one. That is why this recent contract situation around Devin Achane suddenly became extremely important for Detroit. The Miami Dolphins reached an extension with Achane that made headlines because people instantly saw the total value and assumed the running back market was exploding again. But when you actually break the numbers down, this deal may have helped the Lions more than anybody expected. Achane signed a 4-year extension worth major money overall, including significant guaranteed money. But the important detail is this: the contract did not completely reset the running back market. That is the key. For months, there was growing fear that Gibbs would eventually demand something far beyond the current top running back deals because of how unique he is as a player. There were legitimate conversations about Gibbs potentially pushing into the $21, $22, maybe even $23 million per year range in the future if the market continued rising aggressively. But now, the situation suddenly looks much more manageable for Detroit. Achane's average yearly salary came in below what Christian McCaffrey received. It also stayed below Saquon Barkley's level. And when you compare the actual production profiles between Gibbs and Achane, the similarities are honestly shocking. Both players are explosive. Both average elite yards per carry numbers. Both are heavily involved in the passing game. Both create mismatches all over the field. And statistically, their production through similar stretches of games is remarkably close. Gibbs averages around 5.3 yards per carry, while Achane sits around 5.6. Their rushing yard averages are nearly identical. Their receiving production is extremely close as well. These are two modern NFL weapons that completely stress defenses. The difference is that Gibbs is doing it on a contender in Detroit, while Achane has been buried on a Miami team that has struggled to stay relevant consistently. But around the league, executives absolutely notice these comparisons when negotiations happen, and this is where things get really interesting for the Lions. Because Detroit already knows massive money is eventually going toward Aiden Hutchinson, that situation became much more expensive after edge rusher contracts around the league exploded. Myles Garrett helped push the market higher. Then Micah Parsons took things even further. Suddenly, what once looked like a possible $35 million yearly contract for Hutchinson turned into conversations closer to $45 or even $50 million annually. That is how fast markets change in the NFL. The Lions learned that lesson the hard way, but they also learned the opposite lesson with Amon-Ra St. Brown. Detroit got ahead of the wide receiver market early with St. Brown, and now his deal looks like an absolute steal compared to what other receivers are making. One after another, receivers signed larger deals after him. Garrett Wilson now makes more money annually. Jackson Smith-Njigba helped push prices even higher, and suddenly Amon-Ra St. Brown, one of the best receivers in football, no longer looks outrageously expensive at all. The Lions benefited massively because they acted before the market exploded. Now at running back, Detroit may be catching another break. The market is not completely crashing, but it is stabilizing. And if Gibbs eventually lands somewhere in that $18 to $20 million range, instead of pushing beyond that, the Lions may save themselves millions every single season. Over the life of a contract, that matters tremendously. That extra money becomes the difference between keeping another starter or losing somebody important down the road. And when you look at Gibbs' current cap structure, things become even more fascinating. His cap hit right now is already manageable, and Detroit has control with the 5th-year option already sitting there around $14 million. That gives Brad Holmes flexibility. It gives the front office room to structure a future extension without completely crippling the salary cap immediately. This is exactly the kind of hidden front office victory championship teams need. Fans always focus on touchdowns, draft picks, and blockbuster moves. But sustaining a contender is about timing. Timing contracts correctly, predicting market trends correctly, getting stars signed before chaos happens around the league. And right now, it feels like the Lions may have just received a huge assist from a contract signed hundreds of miles away in Miami, because if the running back market truly settles into this range, Detroit suddenly has a much more realistic path toward keeping Jahmyr Gibbs long term without sacrificing flexibility elsewhere on the roster. And honestly, when you think about what Gibbs already means to this offense, that could end up becoming one of the most important developments of the entire offseason. So now the question becomes, if Jahmyr Gibbs eventually signs an extension around that 18 to 20 million range, do you believe the Lions should lock him in immediately, or would you still wait before committing that kind of money to a running back? The reason this conversation matters so much right now is because the Detroit Lions are no longer operating like a rebuilding team trying to find stars. Those days are over. Brad Holmes already found the stars. Dan Campbell already built the culture. Now this organization is entering the phase where every major decision becomes about sustaining success, while the entire league starts circling around your roster, trying to figure out which pieces you eventually will not be able to afford anymore. That is what happens to contenders. And honestly, when you look at what Detroit has built, Jahmyr Gibbs may quietly be one of the most important players in the entire future of this offense, because what makes Gibbs special is not just the speed. Everybody talks about the speed. Everybody sees the home run ability, but what truly separates him is how complete he already looks this early in his career. Defenses cannot treat him like a traditional running back because he is not one. The moment he motions out wide, the defense has to adjust. The second he catches a pass in space, linebackers immediately look overmatched. And when Detroit gets into rhythm offensively, Gibbs becomes almost impossible to contain because he forces defenses into impossible choices. If you stack the box, he can beat you outside. If you play lighter coverage, Detroit can run directly at you. If you focus too much on Amon-Ra St. Brown, Gibbs punishes you underneath. And if you hesitate for even 1 second, the play is already over because Gibbs can erase angles instantly. That is why this contract discussion is not some small offseason topic. This is about protecting one of the foundational pieces of the Lions championship window. And the most encouraging part for Detroit fans is that the Lions finally appeared to be operating like a franchise that understands timing better than ever before. Look at how calculated this front office has become. They are constantly thinking 2 or 3 years ahead. They understand which positions are exploding financially across the NFL and which markets might stabilize. That matters because one bad contract decision can suddenly force difficult sacrifices elsewhere on the roster. You already know Hutchinson is going to command elite edge rusher money. Penei Sewell is already paid because elite offensive tackles are priceless. Amon-Ra St. Brown got paid before the receiver market completely exploded. Kirby Joseph will eventually enter conversations too. Brian Branch will not stay cheap forever either. Every single year, another cornerstone player becomes extension eligible. And eventually even great rosters start losing talent because the salary cap forces hard choices. That is why the Akane contract caught so much attention. Not because Akane is better than Gibbs. Not because Gibbs suddenly becomes cheap. But because the deal may have slowed down what many feared would become an uncontrollable running back market jump for elite dual threat players. And the funny thing is, a few years ago, nobody even believed running backs would reach this level financially again. The position had started getting devalued across the NFL. Teams became hesitant to hand out massive second contracts. But then players like Christian McCaffrey reminded everybody how dangerous an elite all-purpose weapon can be. Saquon Barkley's market helped elevate things further. Suddenly, teams realize these players still completely change offenses when utilized correctly. That is exactly what Gibbs does for Detroit. The Lions do not need him to carry the football 30 times a game to dominate a defense. His impact goes far beyond raw rushing numbers. Sometimes his presence alone changes how opponents line up before the snap. Defensive coordinators spend entire weeks trying to prepare for the stress he creates. And when you combine that with Detroit's offensive line, everything becomes even more dangerous. Because this is not just a talented player on a mediocre offense. This is an elite weapon attached to one of the best offensive infrastructures in football. The Lions know that. The league knows that, which is exactly why fans became nervous about what a future extension could eventually cost. But now there is at least a little breathing room. If Detroit can keep Gibbs closer to the current market instead of watching the number skyrocket beyond $22 million annually, that changes future roster planning significantly. Even saving $4 or $5 million per year becomes massive once multiple stars are under contract simultaneously. And this is why Brad Holmes has earned so much trust from this fan base. He understands value, he understands positional importance, and maybe most importantly, he understands when to strike early before prices become impossible. We already saw it happen with Amon-Ra St. Brown. At the time, some people thought Detroit was paying huge money. Now that contract looks incredibly team-friendly compared to newer receiver deals around the NFL. That is what smart timing can do. The Lions are trying to build something sustainable, not just something exciting for one season. And if this Gibbs situation continues trending in Detroit's favor financially, it could become another major advantage for a roster that is already loaded with talent, because make no mistake, the Lions are entering a stretch where every dollar matters. Championship windows stay open when front offices consistently win these hidden battles behind the scenes. Fans see the touchdowns on Sundays, but organizations survive long-term because of decisions made months and years earlier at negotiating tables. And right now, Detroit may have just avoided a scenario where the Gibbs contract conversation became dramatically more expensive than expected. That could end up being enormous for the future of this team. But at the same time, there is still one huge question hanging over all of this. If Jahmyr Gibbs continues developing into one of the most dangerous offensive weapons in football next season, could his value eventually become impossible to compare to any other running back in the league? And that is the part Lions fans really need to think about moving forward, because there is a legitimate argument that Jahmyr Gibbs should not even be viewed through the same lens as a traditional running back anymore. The NFL keeps trying to categorize players into positions, but certain talents eventually force teams to completely rethink those labels, and Gibbs is starting to look like one of those players. When Detroit drafted him, there were people across the league who questioned the move immediately. A lot of analysts thought the Lions reached. Some people could not understand why Detroit would invest such a high pick into a running